April 28th began as a typical day in the life. We were doing typical things. My wife and I had gone into Lethbridge, Alberta, which is a half-hour drive from where we live in Taber, to do some shopping. We got in the door and the phone was ringing. The voice on the other end of the line said, this is the hospital calling. Your son Jason is in the emergency ward, and it's very serious. You need to come to the hospital right now. We got to the hospital and got into the emergency, full of anxiety and fear, of course. A person greeted us and said, your son Jason's been shot. Can't tell you how shocking, how unbelievable to hear those words. I can't tell you how much we all live in that place where it always happens somewhere else to somebody else.
None of it makes sense. Why would anyone take a 13-year-old girl to a shack, on her way home, obviously on her way home from school, and tie her and leave her there to die? None of it makes sense. And to this day, we don't know who did it.
In March of 1980, I received a phone call early one morning from an RCMP officer from Montreal telling me that my brother had been found murdered and left dead in a field outside of Montreal. So then you become the victim. And then I needed then a frame of reference for me to be able to keep functioning in the ministry. And then I started looking more closely at the Bible, at the history, at the theology. And I started discovering that in the best of tradition, there's a lot of violence, but there's always also a trend that starts speaking that in any conflict that arises, we must hear the voice of the victim. But we must also listen to the story of the offender. And so I started doing more research, and I discovered that what I call an incredible treasure, which is restorative justice.
Restorative justice is both a philosophical and a spiritual movement, reflecting on criminal justice reform. Whatever else crime might mean in the conventional criminal justice system, it means something very, very specific in restorative justice. It says that crime breaks human relationships, that what it does is destroy the peace and security felt in community, that it makes it impossible for victims and offenders alike to continue living in peace and security unless those harms have been healed. In short, what restorative justice says is that the harms caused by crime have to be healed through peace.
Restorative justice builds on an understanding of crime that is more than just law breaking, but that also involves injury to victims, to communities, to even the offenders and their families.
Restorative justice is about rehabilitation at a certain level. It's about deterrence and about protecting the community from offenders. It's very much about that. And it's also very much about doing justice. It's about getting offenders to take accountability for their actions. It's about getting justice done for victims by dealing with the harm and the injury that happens to victims. It's about healing the relationship between the offender and the victim, between the offender and the community, between the victim and the community, all of those things that are broken down in a criminal offense.
And I want to quote in that context Berman, that's on page 6 of his introduction. It's a short quotation. It says, "In the 20th century, however, for the first time, religion has become largely a private affair, while law has become largely a matter of practical expediency. The connection between the religious metaphor and the legal metaphor has been broken."
In our discussions and debates during this week, we were really fascinated with number of issues arising from the discussions that has enriched my own knowledge about my own tradition, and I have learned a great deal from other perspectives and other religious traditions.
And I think it's the case within all our traditions.
Theoretically, at its best, Islam has many elements of restorative justice, because Islam is very much of has a legalistic component when it comes to crime and punishment, and that legalistic component is mostly compatible with restorative justice ideas and programs.
Your body never took that kind of thing, your cleanliness and everything.
In the case of Buddhism, there hasn't been historically enough sensitivity to the problem of the victim and the problem of, again, restoring the whole social fabric. And this is where I think the restorative justice movement has something extremely important to offer to Buddhism and to the Buddhist understanding of the situation.
I've heard over and over again how the lawyers try to silence the victims. They don't want the emotion in the courtroom. They don't want any outbursts. They want nothing of the reality and the trauma and the truth-seeking that a victim needs. We also want some kind of prevention, some kind of assurance that this isn't going to happen again, and that isn't being given to us either in the courtrooms, because the courtroom doesn't solicit any kind of remorse response, at least not usually, from the offender, and that's what we want. Why do we want remorse? Why do we want repentance? It's not just so that we'll feel good. It's so that we know that that person won't ever do this again and that we can feel safe.
Through the process of listening and talking and feeling, there's a space opened where people can be healed. The circle process is a unique combination of an Aboriginal concept of healing circles and a Western concept of sentencing. Now that might sound like a strange combination, but somehow it has been able to integrate and, as a result, honor the Aboriginal traditions at the same time as honoring the Western tradition of rights and procedure, which for many liberal scholars is critical for the Western culture.
Now, I was very afraid, using his vehicle as a weapon. That's what I felt he was doing.
A sentence of jail would probably ensure that you were in jail again. It would not solve the problem, and the public would not be protected. And I am prepared to take the calculated risk and follow the recommendation of the family and circle with respect to sentencing. The difference with this process is it's a very emotional encounter. The process could last from 3 hours to 7 hours. It's very demanding on the participants. They have to be prepared to listen to what people have to say, and not only listen but hear what they have to say and respect the difference between individuals. And through the process, empathy develops, an understanding of each other, not only the offender and the victim, but everyone in the process. They have to be open to emotion and feeling. And in that process, there comes a stage where something happens. And it's been described by people who participate as magic, Gestalt shift, depending on which perspective you come from, a spiritual experience. But it's that point of connectiveness between the participants that's critical in the process. Now you can appreciate that's not what normally happens in a traditional courtroom.
I knew I was guilty of the crime that I committed, and I actually pled guilty, and that was the only time that I actually got to say anything. I was asked if I understood the severity of my offense, and I said yes. And that was one word I spoke in 5 or 6 court appearances. All the rest, your lawyer does the talking for you. You're not allowed to say anything. You're not allowed to appear any way at all. I was not even allowed to look at my wife sitting in the courtroom. He said, better if you don't look there, because I told him, I said, if I look there, I might break down. He says, well, don't do that. If you're going to break down, don't look that way. So you don't even look at them.
I think that with the retributive justice system, victims are often, and most of the time, left out of the equation. And so are the offender in a way, because his needs are not met as well. And so the concept of restorative justice appeals to me in that it requires one to take responsibility and accountability.
I've dealt with a lot of that shame and embarrassment. I mean,